Uh, well, all right. I'm going to just start with a little fanfare for Ted on this Laotian mouth organ that I sometimes play at talks. Is that like out of character for an academic conference? No, it's all right. Yeah. All right. So, I'm screwing up the little lavalier alternative. Okay, there we go. I like playing instruments around the world because they remind me how far computers have to go as expressive devices. So these things are kind of still like a lot better than any computer thing I've ever used, so it just gives you perspective. But another thing that gives me perspective is TED, because my view of computer history is this gigantic fall from grace that's the mirror image of Moore's Law. Now, that's not entirely fair. There are some things we've figured out, and I'm very happy with some of the work we've been able to do over the last few decades. But a lot of the early ideas, and particularly TED's, seem to me to have a kind of a holistic sensibility, and just a sensibility in general, that we've gradually dismantled for no good reason. So what I'm going to do in my talk is go through a couple of examples of what I see as that fall from grace. And I just want to emphasize, I'm not a defeatist. I'm absolutely optimistic. I'm absolutely delighted to work in technology. But to me, what that means is that we have to gradually, in a sense, find our way back to TED. I don't know how long it'll take, because we've kind of screwed up a few things. And as we all know, once you screw up something digital, climbing back's not easy, right? A digital mistake makes the worst legacy hassle of anything. We end up really creating little prisons of our own making just by setting one bit the wrong way. It's so nuts. But where shall I begin? The first thing I'll say is that when I was a kid, when I was a teenager in the 70s, which is when I got into this game, I didn't meet TED until just a little later, I think right around the start of the 80s, if I remember. But when I was a kid, I was enormously moved by one aspect of TED's thinking, which is in a way not as talked about as much, because TED's remembered as the person who, proposed the first digital networking architecture. Let's not forget that. His 1960 ideas predated packet switching and certainly the ARPANET. But he's remembered for understanding the underlying network nature of human thinking, hypertext and hypermedia. But there's this other thing that he also proposed right at the start, which is that if you remembered the provenance for where bits came from a network, you could use that knowledge as the basis for a universal micropayment system. And that, in turn, was the first new idea about economics in a way for a century or something like that. I mean, it's really a remarkable idea that's still underappreciated. Going way back, and I mean, we could go, in my book where I write about this, I go back to Aristotle and even earlier to talk about the origins of this dilemma. But just for a slightly more contemporary reference, we could talk about the Luddites and then the early Marxist writings about them and other struggles. There was this problem that people were becoming aware of, which is that mankind changes its own situation through inventing technologies, and perhaps through just a touch of moral and ethical improvement. Sometimes that can be debated, but at any rate, there's definitely a difference between one period of history and another period of history, and one of the changes is technological. So we're on some sort of a ramp, and naturally we wonder, well, where's that ramp leading? And Aristotle was the first to set down in text the explicit concern, which is that, people become obsolete if the machines get good. Now, he actually likes it because he's a snob, and he thinks it'll only happen to somebody else. There's this wonderful passage where he's saying, well, you know, we really need music, but the unfortunate thing, I'm paraphrasing him slightly, but not too much. The unfortunate thing is that these musicians are such pesky characters, which we are, by the way. And, you know, if we just had machines, and it's an amazing thing, he said, if we could just have machines that could operate the looms and pluck the strings of the lutes, you know, we could get these guys out of town. We wouldn't have to put up with these pathetic slaves anymore. And, you know, sure enough, automated looms turned out to be one of the flashpoints for modernity with the Luddites. And musicians were Napsterized before anybody else. So he got it exactly right in that case. I still think he was kind of a snob, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for him in many ways. But be that as it may, Marx took this idea, this concern, and really made it explicit. So if you read the early Marx, starting in the 1840s, you're really reading a technology writer. And I had never understood Marx in these terms until I was driving in Silicon Valley, and there was this thing on the radio, and there was this guy going on and on about, we're going to bust down obstacles to commerce between nations. We're going to bust down obstacles to labor. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but the language was similar. And I thought to myself, oh my God, another one of these stupid startups that's trying to get bought by Google. I can't stand to listen to this another minute. And I was going to turn it off. And then suddenly the voice said, this has been an anniversary reading of Das Kapital. And I was, oh wait, I'm listening. I'm listening to KPFA, the lefty station. And so if you get just the right passages, you really realize that Marx was thinking ahead to what it would be like if you lived in a world of such advanced technology that it would bypass people. And so his conclusion, of course, is that you could no longer rely on emergent systems like commerce because they would become corrupted and they would falter, and there had to be some sort of societal system that would dole out the benefits of the machines. And his criticism, I think, was right on. His solution failed, in my view, for two reasons. One is empirically, it's created some of the most murdersome regimes in history, which is not an easy competition to enter because the bar is very high. And theoretically, the problem, it becomes clear when you finally get to the place in Marx where you read his idea of what happens after the revolution, where he talks about, well, we'll all enjoy manicured lawns and we'll read the classics and practice archery. And I'm kind of with him on the classics. I kind of like my lawn scruffy. And archery, I don't know. So, you know, you realize this thing that to have a society that's top-down planned like that, you better fit into whoever has the power or you don't fit. So you can see where the theoretical problem is, and then we can see the empirical problem. Now, Ted came along and finally, after so many years had passed, offered the first alternative way through this dilemma. And what he said is, you know what? And I'm paraphrasing once again, Ted, my apologies. It's easier to get Aristotle wrong than you wrong when you're like sitting there, but that's true, yeah. So, well, sorry, Ari. Anyway, so to paraphrase Ted and oversimplify a bit, if you had a universal micropayment system that would just keep track of what people had contributed to the digital ecosystem, even when the machines get really, really good, and you can think of them as being autonomous, they'll still be dependent on information systems. All that information will ultimately have come from people. The way it works is not that you just do information systems once and they're good forever, but they need constant revamping, constant maintenance. So what you would get is a society where people would be contributed for actually doing what needs to be done in such an advanced future. And that might suddenly create a new kind of fair, emergent, distributed society. In a way, it's pushing capitalism so far that it turns into something completely different than it started out as. No, I don't think so. I think Bitcoin misses the mark and actually becomes a plutocracy-creating machine because it's emulating gold. It's emulating an Ayn Rand idea of an economy. It's anti-fiscal. But that's another story.
As long as there's still gold that has Bitcoin in mind, which ends in a few years, then you are rewarding.
Not really, because you can't issue new Bitcoin, so you can't even have moderate inflation to reflect genuine increases in human capability. So you end up super empowering the people who were there first, just like any Silicon Valley scheme. So I think there's a lot of mechanisms in Bitcoin that are cool, but on the macroeconomic level, I think it's a huge disaster. But that's only Ted gets to interrupt me. By the way, those are the rules. Okay. All right. So anyway, so this really enthused me because a lot of us have been going through this like Adam Smith, no Marx, Ayn Rand, no Friedman, no, and you go back and forth between these two things, and you finally just think they're both full of it. It's like we've got to get out of this stupid left-right thing. Neither really works, and here's the only alternative I've ever seen articulated. It's the first path through the horns of that dilemma. An aspect of that is keeping track of, now I just want to tell a couple of anecdotes. Ted, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember it so vividly. The year's about 1980 or so, maybe earlier, it might have been 79, and it's either on the Stanford campus or near it, and there was a thing called the Homebrew Club that used to meet. Waz will know about that. And there was a time when you were talking, and this group of anti-capitalist, anarcho, pseudo-Marxist, whatever, from the Bay Area in full regalia showed up and shouted you down and were just terribly rude and obnoxious. They're like, we're watching you. We're watching your every move because you want to bring money into the digital network. And at the end, there was this barrage that just like shut. It was like a denial of service attack, basically. And it wasn't distributed, though. It was just these guys in these weird costumes. And and at the end of it, you said two words to them, which maybe shouldn't be repeated in public, but I will, just for the sake of academic accuracy. You said, well, fuck you, too. And which I think was exactly the right thing to say, because what else could you say to them? They weren't going to listen. Do you remember this?
I remember saying that. I thought it was
That was later. That was another. That's another period that was later. This was like. God, I feel like I could almost remember who these people were. Anyway, it was some weird Bay Area thing, right? And so there was this. I felt that they really, really missed the boat because they were still locked into this left versus right thing, and they were thinking, well, either you have two choices. You're either Marx or you're Ayn Rand, and there's no in between. But there was, but they couldn't see it. They were too locked into this stupid dichotomy that's captured the imaginations of the world for how many decades now? I mean, we're going to go on centuries, and it's just time to realize there actually is an alternative.
well, since Manichaeanism, it's an Asian religion, devil versus God.
That's exactly right. It's the Manichaean fallacy. Once again, old human vanities, old human foibles reasserting themselves in a technological era where we can ill afford them. So, what I want to talk about is a couple of my personal memories of the stations along the way to the fall from grace. I'm going to just tell a couple of little stories that I think capture some of the ideas. Around that same time, or actually I think a year or two earlier, when I was a kid, I was around Xerox PARC a fair amount, and Alan Kay was very kind to me back then, who isn't here, I don't think yet, but there was this weird thing at Xerox PARC. They had network computers. They'd invented Ethernet. So they had all these machines that were networked. And they also had an interface that resembled what we'd now think of as a Mac or Windows interface, right? They made up that stuff. And so there was a strange, when you were dealing with information, you could cut, copy, or paste. But the thing is, every young computer science whiz kid knew that if you had a connected network, you had no reason to copy because the original was still there because it's a network. And so if somebody didn't get that, you'd say, what kind of Neanderthal are you? Don't you understand what digital networking means? The original's still there. Plus, it's better than just being there. You have its context and its history. You preserve some of its provenance. You get more meaning than you would have if you just had it in isolation. So the whole idea of cutting, pasting, and copying is the stupidest thing in the world. What you should do is a reference to it. Read these Ted Nelson books. And so these graduate students from Stanford were also at PARC, and they hustled me aside into a corner, kind of forcefully, and said, don't say that! I'm like, why not? It's the most, this is the stupidest thing in the world. Why are you guys copying documents? Why? And they said, we are sponsored by a copying machine company. Everything has to be framed in terms of documents and copying them. Get it. Get with it. You're going to have to go for funding someday soon if you want to grow up in this environment. Don't be a moron. And I'm like, oh my God, I totally blew it. And like a Xerox person almost heard me say those forbidden words. So there was this bizarre way in which we started off the art of usable user interface by copying the previous paper-based world of information processing, which itself was based on copying onto new copies of paper. And that was this huge, I already said the word fuck, so I guess I can say it again. It was this huge fuck up. I think, now I don't, I mean, I must point out, Xerox didn't really come through all that well with that whole PARC thing at the end of the day, and other companies probably benefited a bit more. And maybe it would have been better to give them a harder time about it, but it's hard to say in retrospect. All of us have compromised what we do for funding, and don't pretend you haven't. We all do it. But anyway, there was a dynamic like that going on. Another interesting moment happened around 91-ish or so when Tim Berners-Lee came out with the idea for HTML on the web and all this. And what was striking about this is that the first time I saw it, and anybody I knew saw it, they said, wait a second, this is weird because it doesn't have the backlinks. It's like one directional. You can link to something, but it doesn't know it was linked to. And everybody knew that the whole point of hypermedia was the context, because the context is where meaning comes from. Without context, it's just bits, right? Like, you know, you can't, bits are meaningless without the context to decode them, so why shouldn't that be embedded in the network itself by remembering where they originated? And there were plenty of hypermedia projects at that time that had two-way links. Too many to mention right now, but I just saw a little button for HyperCard, I think, and that was one. But there are many others, including, of course, Xanadu. And so, like, what's this one-way linking thing? What the hell is this thing? And then the argument for it was, well, it's just so much easier to implement. Nobody's responsible to anybody else. It'll spread fast. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not what civilization is for. That's, like, not a good thing. But, of course, it did spread fast, and it took over. And this led to this sort of don't worry, be crappy phase of Silicon Valley, in my view. This was, this is a famous, I didn't make that up. That was a famous thing in Silicon Valley. I forget who did make it up. Do you remember? Somebody, anyway, one of the Silicon Valley figures came up with that as like sort of the path to riches. Like just go for people before you go for quality. Just get a bunch of people locked into whatever the hell it is, then worry about whether it's any good later. And that's been the formula ever since. That's been, well, most recently WhatsApp is a great example. The point is, just get people roped in, get them locked into your thing, even if, and just the first, second, third, and fourth priority is something that'll spread fast, that'll spread easily. And a lot of those things have good qualities, but they're only half good because the price you pay, basically it's a short-term way of thinking. Like if you prioritize rapid spread first, then later on you have to pay for it. Now, in my view, a lot of the Silicon Valley world that's arisen since the turn of the century has essentially created gigantic fortunes trying to reconstruct the backlinks that were lost. For instance, if everything knew, if there were two-way links and everything knew what was pointing at it, all you'd have to do is count up all of those things and find where there were the most links, and you'd have Google. The information would be right there, and it would be public. But because all that was thrown away, Google had to scrape the whole internet, or the whole web, every night and calculate the backlinks that might have been there and count up where the most of them were in order to sell it to people as a service, to advertisers in this case. But that should have been there from the start. So it's just making up for a hole, right? And so the price of doing these really quick, and by the way, Tim's great. Tim Berners-Lee is a great guy. I don't mean to rat on him too much. And he's done a lot of great work with the World Wide Web organization, all that. So this isn't, I don't want this to be construed in any sense as an attack on him, but it's more just the general trend. I'm trying to capture a sense of what's happened to computer science. That, if you do these designs that are only halfway done in order to get very rapid diffusion of a particular design, the effect on society is ultimately extreme privatization, because somebody has to come along to fix it later, and it's no longer society but just some company. So what it does is it becomes an engine of income inequality. Incomplete digital designs create income inequality is the basic message here. Facebook's another one. If you had two-way links, you'd know who was interested in what you're doing. You'd meet them. But because everything's anonymized, everything's just half-assed, is that a way to put it? It's only one way. It takes some huge structure, some big company, to, in that case, within a proprietary shell, calculate the backlinks, which is essentially their service. And if you look at the big Silicon Valley success stories, they're essentially privatizing the gap between what Tim did and what Ted knew needed to be done from decades earlier. And that particular gap filling has created the fastest, biggest fortunes in history. Isn't that astonishing? All right. I'm kind of sorry to put it that way, Ted. And so, now, just to put that in a bit of economic perspective, or macroeconomic perspective, if you look at, so in my view, you can't have a democracy without a middle class. And this is something that I think Ted understood from the very, very beginning, that hypothetical access to information is not the same thing as having empowered access to information. So, as an example, right now, any of us can have access to most of the information that a Google or a Bing can have access to, but we don't have city-sized computer facilities, cooled by rivers to process statistical measurements of them, so we're not equally empowered to make use of the information. So mere openness isn't enough. There has to be a distribution of the ability to use the information, or you end up with a hyper-extreme amount of income inequality, which then will undermine democracy. Now, what's interesting to me is that if you look at the online societies where people do contribute for free right now, like the Linux community, the early Wikipedia, not so much recently, because I feel like the Wikipedia has come under control of cliques recently, like any communist experiment, but the early Wikipedia, and much of the open source community to this day, if you look at who depends on whose contributions, you see this amazing thing within it. You see a middle class bump. They're superstars, not a lot of them. They're loafers. But there are an amazing number of people who contribute a little. And that's the future of the middle class when the machines get good. If only there was a Nelsonian micropayment scheme. Now, if you look at the history of the middle class, you see it rising in fits and starts, never more so than in the post-war period in the developed countries, right? Where you see this incredible, unprecedented rise in the middle class. And then starting around the 80s, it starts, we backslid. Now, there's no innovation required to have extreme concentration of power in a society. That's been the historical norm through the ages. It apparently is so that there is innovation required to sustain a strong middle class, however. Now, what bothers me is that the rhetoric of online activists ever since those people attacked you in the talk at the Homebrew Club, what's bothered me is that there's been this rhetoric that all this open source stuff, all this open information, based on lost provenance, so we can copy without knowing who it came from. That particular idea of openness, context-free openness, that idea has been promoted as something that will make people rise up, that will create all this wealth. I think it has worked a little bit in the developing world. I think rural populations in Asia and Africa have actually benefited a bit. But the point is that the destination they all want is development. And in the developed world, the rise of that kind of networking has corresponded to the decline of the middle class, universally in every developed country. So, as an empiricist, you have to say, either what we're doing is irrelevant to preserving the middle class, or it might be useful but we're not doing enough, or we're part of the problem. Those are the only options. And it's crucial to figure out which is more true, right? So my feeling, after having studied it a bit, and this is what my last book is about, is that we've actually been part of the problem. That in area after area, by decontextualizing network information, we're concentrating the wealth in whoever can process it the best instead of in the people who originated it. So I'll give you the simple example that I like to use because it's the clearest one, which is language translators. So people who translate books, and I bet there's some people in the room here who do translations once in a while, they've been experiencing a decline in their fortunes and their prospects that's analogous to what's happened earlier for musicians, photographers, investigative journalists, and so forth. And yet, people are using translation more than ever. Now you might say, well, there's automated translation, so those translators are buggy whips. You must love creative destruction. If they're obsolete, they're obsolete. That is just the sad nature of reality. You must accept it. Except they're not buggy whips. And the reason they're not buggy whips has to do with how document translation turns out to actually work. Now, way back, so I should mention, one of my dearest and most important mentors was a guy named Marvin Minsky, and who's just lovely and was infinitely generous and sweet to me for many years, and I adore him. But I kind of disagree with him about a lot of stuff. He kind of has to show me a theorem, in fact, for me to agree with him on something. But Marvin, way back in the late 50s, shortly after the Dartmouth conference where they coined the term artificial intelligence, he assigned some students a summer project of using a dictionary and an algorithm to translate between languages, because it seemed to make sense. And Noam Chomsky had been promoting this idea that there's some compact, well-describable structure in a language, so why couldn't you do it? I mean, it wasn't a terrible hypothesis. It turned out it didn't work. And it didn't work, and it didn't work for years and years and years and years. And finally, what turned out to work was discovered at IBM's research labs much later, and it was big data and statistics. So what you do is you take in a very large number of pre-existing translations made by real people, and then you isolate turns of phrase that exist in a new document you want to translate. You mash up the most similar occurrences of previous turns of phrase with a new one, and that mashup is legible. Suddenly you have something that's intelligible. Suddenly you have something that works. Now, the interesting thing about that is you can't just gather information once, because communication relies on a constantly shifting, previously never explicitly represented world of popular references, metaphors, current events, new slang, all of these things. And it changes rapidly enough that if you miss that, even for a few days, your document translation suffers. So the places that offer free automatic translation, like Google and Microsoft and many others now, they have to scrape the whole universe of translation every single night to freshen their databases so that their algorithms will continue to function. So here's what we have. We do not have a population of buggy whips. Instead, we have something much trickier, which is people who we pretend don't exist in order to create the illusion of a freestanding AI. We currently do not have the scientific understanding of how the brain represents information or meaning. That, I can make that statement in an absolute unqualified way. We have the barest peeks into little tiny bits about how the brain works, but we don't have a theory of semantics in the brain. Therefore, every instance of operational AI is in fact a way of disempowering people to concentrate money. Do you get that? Okay, that's a crucial thing to understand. So in order to create this edifice of these automatic services, we have to disenfranchise all the people who are contributing the data that makes them actually function on a constant basis. And then, now, what I just described for language translators in many variations applies to a whole host of other professions and industries. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing now because I want this to be more about Ted than my own ideas. But I think it applies to musicians and journalists and so forth, obviously. But I think it'll also eventually apply to manufacturing, because the designs for manufacturing goods have to come from somewhere, even if they're 3D printed. But 3D printers have been distributed so far on a Linux model where we forget where the design came from. So the key issue is provenance here. The forgetting of provenance not only has philosophical and semantic problems, but it's economically a catastrophe as the machines get better and better in this century. Make sense? All right. So I don't want to go in, like I said, I don't want to go into the whole thing, but there's a whole much larger story that I can go on for hours and hours about if anybody fails to restrain me. However, I will tell a couple of other little anecdotes about how we lost provenance. In the 1970s and in the early 80s, when packet switching was getting around, there'd been some experiments with networking, initially here in California, between Southern and Northern California. There were kind of two kinds of young men who were operating the first network computers at long distances. One kind was the hippie, and the other kind was the military guy who tended to be kind of redneck. And there were more hippies than rednecks. And I'm oversimplifying here. But what was interesting is that in the 70s, both of them had a very, very strong bias to destroy Providence, even though they knew in their heart of hearts that technically it was the wrong decision. For the hippies, it was all about Vietnam. The draft had only recently ended, and actually there's even an overlap between the active draft and the start of networking. But for the most part, it was a recent memory, but still a live one, and people were worried that it could become active again. You still had to register. I remember having to register when I turned 18, which would have been 77 or 8 or something. And this notion that putting yourself on a list that the government knows about, making you too easy to find, is just dangerous. And so there was this very strong feeling that the right way to limit government power and to support individual liberty was anonymity. And that was very powerful. I remember in the early 80s around MIT working with early ideas about encryption to order pizza or something like that. People really into this idea that you could digitally hide. And so provenance was the most uncool thing in the world. That was what the man wanted you to do, is to leave a trail. Meanwhile, the redneck types, the military guys who were also involved in the early ARPANET, had a completely different thing going on. How many people remember CB radio? So this was a thing that got as much play as Twitter does today, amazingly enough. And there was just these little radios where you talk to people and you'd make up an anonymous handle, a ridiculous sounding handle, so nobody would know who you are. And the main purpose of it was so that people could share where the police were so you could get away with speeding. Because Jimmy Carter had imposed a 55-mile-an-hour limit, and people hated that. They wanted to drive faster. And so for a lot of people who might otherwise have been kind of into preserving provenance, they were like, no, this is CB radio. We want to be anonymous. And so what happened was this early culture of networking was created by young men who, of all stripes, wanted to hide. And that, in a way, had an even greater effect than the tale I told about Xerox PARC or Tim Berners-Lee's one-way linking design. And I think what it goes to show is that making a society in which people aren't afraid kind of goes hand in hand with making a society that preserves provenance. But I think an aspect of that has to be a form of provenance that actually benefits people. The form of provenance that exists right now is one that discriminates against the individual whose provenance has been preserved. Right now, companies like Google and Facebook don't make money with traditional advertising, which romantically tries to convince you of something. Instead, they micromanage the options right in front of you. And because of the cost of choice, this becomes, for the whole population, a deterministic form of behavior modification, which has overtaken such things as electoral politics and who gets insurance, who gets credit offers, all kinds of things like that. And it becomes a social disaster. Meanwhile, of course, because of Edward Snowden, we know that provenance is being preserved on our behalf by government as well. And so the thing is, provenance must be preserved, but it must be preserved in a way that the people whose provenance is deserved are benefiting from it so that it becomes part of a social contract. And I defy you to show another way to get there other than Ted's ideas. That's the solution. You did it.
While Noah is getting set up, is there a quick question for Jaron?
Yeah. Oh, this is a can. This thing is a can, K-H-A-E-N. It's from Laos. I was not playing it traditionally. Yeah?
Sorry, over here.
I actually chose him. Sorry.
I ask a generally uninformed question about where you think Internet 2.0 is going without it being a big question, how that may relate to any improvements in the Internet.
Well, Internet 2 usually refers to this academic consortium, and I was the chief scientist of it for a while, and I can say with some authority we don't have any clue. But if you mean in general, where's the Internet actually going? You know, I feel really optimistic about it. You know, For all the problems I talked about, I also feel like a lot of things are sort of kind of getting better. I think people are getting a clue about it. I don't know. I mean, it's going to take a while to turn it around at this point, for sure. That's it. Hey, thanks.